Forgive me if I'm a little rusty. I haven't really looked at these slides in a while, and it's my fault. Anyway, what is front-end development and why is it broken? Front-end development is programming the visual layer of a web application. Ruby apps like Hulu, GitHub, and CamMPad look the way they do because of front-end development. The front-end developer is just as necessary as the back-end developer. Despite this necessity, front-end development has a severe lack of attention and care. There's very little definition and documentation available compared to back-end development. And this leads to huge problems for our community, and it would be wise to fix it. Let's define our typical web development team. We have 1, the designer, aka eye candy. 2, we have a back-end developer, aka programmer. And 3, we have the front-end developer, aka the wounded one, me. So here's a typical flow for development. A story is defined with features. From there, the designer starts creating a design for that story, for example, user registration. And at the same time, the backend developer can start writing features to integrate that story into the app. Once the design is ready, the front-end developer takes the design, hooks it up into the application, and hooks it up to the backend. Okay, that's nice, but in practice, it doesn't actually happen that easily. Somewhere along the way, the front-end layer begins to break down. In fact, the state of things today with front-end development is dire, and we need to fix it. We have the following issues. 1, it's hard to find people. 2, those doing it might not be doing it at their best. I may very well be one of them. 3, there's a lack of best practices. 4, their learning curve is too damn high. That's a meme. 5, there's very little material available to study. And all of these things have a common root. Very little material available to study. The few good front-end developers who do exist found themselves in that role out of necessity, and most often after years of failures. And sure, everyone requires failure and experimentation to become good, but when you have the issues with the state of things today, you have perpetual carelessness, and that makes front-end development harder for everyone, and that's not good. Could I find an outline of best practices for HTML and CSS within Rails? No, not really. Sure, outside of Rails, but I'm here to tell you that doesn't always apply. You might be saying, wait, what's this guy talking about? CSS? What the hell? Why would we need best practices for something so simple? Of course there isn't much material on this. It's easy. HTML and CSS is not related to Rails. First of all, front-end development is a lot more than just HTML and CSS. Secondly, HTML and CSS can be extremely complex, especially within a framework like Rails. Most people that come from a programming background may laugh at this concept. Excuse me, I deal with real code. HTML and CSS is not real code. Those are simple languages and anyone can do them. I deal with real stuff like Ruby. Okay, all right. Because of the simple nature of HTML and CSS, it actually exposes a ton of issues in web applications that aren't as noticeable on your basic web pages. Simplicity breeds constraints, and when you have constraints in a web application framework like Rails, it creates issues with maintainability. Developing scalable and efficient HTML and CSS for Rails is hard, and it's a completely different skill set than your basic breed of HTML and CSS knowledge. It's a complex and challenging issue. A best practices guide that explains this within the Rails community would be incredibly useful and helpful. Let's say I was a noob. I'm an aspiring developer. I want to work on the front-end layer. Do I have any references that outline how to work on the front-end layer effectively? No, I don't. A community that doesn't provide an easy path to learn and grow has the consequence of not having enough people available to hire. And this is a really big issue. We need to reduce the learning curve so more talent is available. I manage the visual side of Hybrid Group. I used to be the only front-end developer available across different projects. This was a very bad bottleneck that had to be solved. I needed more front-end developers to work with me. It was nearly impossible to find anyone, let alone anyone advertising these skill sets. So I had to take matters into my own hands and start training aspiring front-end developers. I had no material available from them to learn from. This made the process of training incredibly inefficient. I could only mentor them, and it took months to get them to be efficient on their own. It should not be this way. This is not like the backend layer at all. The backend has a ton of consistency, best practices, and material available to study. Let me give you a real-world team scenario to help clarify these issues. New Rails startup, VC funding, yay! They're working hard to integrate features for a web application. One day the project manager comes in and says to the backend developers, hey guys, I have a design in Photoshop from the designer ready to be integrated. Who's going to do it? What? This is all your faces right now. All of you would look like this. You don't want to do this. Come on, really. It starts to break down this early on. In general, the backend developer does not want to touch the front-end layer. The typical team is not set up properly for integrating designs into a web application. And since it's an annoying design issue and not a logic issue, most teams handle it in the quickest way possible to get rid of the annoyance. And what's the quickest way possible? One, if a backend developer does have Photoshop, take the design, slice it up in whichever way you can, and quickly throw it into the application and get it done as quickly as possible. Two, and/or hire a PSD to HTML service to handle your precious design, let them spend 2 hours hacking it up in their imaginary unsemantic way, and take their hard-earned effort and throw it into your, copy and paste it into your ERB or HAML files. Okay? Many of us are familiar with these solutions. And unfortunately, those are the worst possible solutions. By not investing real effort, you screw yourself in the future. These solutions create a brittle foundation. And what happens is that as you add more code on top of this brittle foundation, it becomes complex, messy, and inefficient. As a consequence, one day you may have to make a change to the design of the app or something similar and realize it requires rewriting the months of foundation that you've previously built. This is a nightmare situation that wastes a lot of time and money. And of course, the problem is that this is the norm. The front-end layer requires dedicated developers. It needs a lot of care and oversight. It's not as simple as just knowing HTML, CSS, and Photoshop. It requires a more than basic understanding of programming, Ruby, and Rails. It also requires a masterful use of HTML and CSS due to the complexity of a framework like Rails. And by the way, that complexity grows with the size of an application. Unfortunately, there are very little resources available to reach this level of mastery. This means there's a severe lack of talent, and it's very likely that the front-end layer is maintained badly. This is a big issue. When a major part of your application is difficult and time-consuming to work on, it hurts everyone involved in the project. The real solution should have been hiring a dedicated front-end developer. The solution is brilliant. It's easy. Unfortunately, it's almost impossible to implement. Why? There's a lack of front-end developers. It's very hard to hire one. So with this scenario, we see that most teams handle the front-end layer quickly and without much care. And even if they wanted to choose the best solution, you either can't find the right person for the job, or you have a very hard time finding the resources on how to do the job effectively yourself. On the bright side, these problems present benefits and opportunities. Let's be clear. If we had more definition, more consistency, and more best practices, and more resources to learn from, we wouldn't have these issues. So we all have huge opportunities if we do solve these issues. By solving them, we can benefit ourselves, our communities, and our teams. It doesn't matter if we're the front-end developer or the back-end developer. We all want our team to be as efficient as possible. What if we could revolutionize front-end development? I'm here to say we can. All you have to do is contribute. Contribute something. Contribute anything. And I'll start with a contribution. Remember, one second. Remember when I said that HTML and CSS can be extremely complex? It's absolutely true. If you've worked with any Rails app, you should understand this. If not, just imagine spaghetti code everywhere. There are a couple things that I've learned that help reduce the complexity, and that keeps me a little bit more sane in my day-to-day workflow. I want to make the following concepts fundamentally required when thinking of front-end development. And if I'm wrong, tell me why. Shout it to the community, and we can refine it together. I'm happy to be wrong. My idea is 3 core concepts to front-end development. 1, architecture. 2, abstraction. 3, foresight. These 3 concepts are core to stable and efficient front-end development. Without these things, the front-end layer of a web application will suffer inefficiencies. What am I talking about? Okay, so what's abstraction, what's architecture, and what the heck do I mean foresight? Architecture is simple. I hate the word, but it just does the job. Architecture is how all the pieces of the front-end layer fit together. It's the grand scope of everything you are developing. It includes semantics, organization, abstraction, and foresight themselves. Abstraction is making your code semantic and understandable to humans. A browser only really cares about the definitions that you give it, like border left, width, height, border right, blah, 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 blah. The classes you put those definitions in are irrelevant to the browser. However, to you as a human, those classes mean everything. By abstracting concepts properly, you're able to create a living world in your code that makes it easier to understand. For example, a class of Pac-Man, a class of comment, a class of post. That's a simple level of abstraction and proper use of semantics. You can abstract things even further in CSS if you had variables, functions, expressions, and traditional programming methods. When you follow this mentality, you become efficient because the entire code base is easier to understand and read. Foresight. Foresight is simply being mindful of the future and growth of your application. The HTML and CSS layer does not have a toolkit available for testing. That means you have to be mindful of the repercussions when making any changes to your code base. This is absolutely critical and a unique problem for the front-end layer. With the back-end layer, you can make changes to your code and have the confidence that your tests will yell at you one way or another and tell you that they're broken. The front-end layer does not have a tool for this. If you break the HTML or styling, you may never know until it's too late. That is an extremely awful situation. So the only way that you could avoid this is with a good architecture in place that is mindful of foresight. Let me paint you a typical picture of the front-end layer of a Rails application that lacks these concepts. It's a damned battleground. There's conflict everywhere. There's a general, you, who has no ability to control his thousands of soldiers or even know where they are. No organization. There's chaos everywhere. It's a nightmare that makes you want to cry. You can't achieve what you truly want to achieve. That's success and organization. I want to add one more picture to really hit things home. Let's say you're integrating styles for a checkout ordering page. You make a small design change to change the styles of a checkout ordering form. Unexpectedly, you broke the styles on a completely different page of the application. Now the design is broken on some other section of the site and you're completely clueless. Hopefully, in a short amount of time, project manager or someone similar will come in yelling at you saying that this is broken and fix it. You're going to be extremely frustrated that you had nothing in place to catch this error. If you can't depend upon tests, what do you depend upon? These pictures and these nightmares, this is typical for Rails on the front-end layer. And it happens for 2 main reasons. There's a lack of care, and we might not know how to do it better, and we can't find the resources on how to do that. Both of these issues would be solved if teams took front-end development seriously and wielded these 3 concepts when working on the front-end layer: architecture, abstraction, and foresight. I left out one important detail because I didn't want to confuse anyone. A few minutes ago, I mentioned you could abstract CSS even further if you had traditional programming methods available. If you did, you'd be able to create more efficient and more understandable code. That solution does exist. It's called SCSS. If you don't know what SCSS is, I highly encourage you to do that googly thing that you do and look it up immediately after this meetup. It is the future of style sheets. Without SCSS, you couldn't actually do any of these concepts effectively. In order to properly evolve the front-end developer, you must use SCSS. It brings the power of programming to CSS, and you can get started right away with a minimal learning curve. It's already baked into default by Rails. It's already baked in Rails by default now, which, by the way, is an example of progress being done on the front-end layer, and that makes me extremely happy. When we do these things, we gain the following abilities. 1, we're able to write one line to write many. 2, we don't have to worry about breaking things unexpectedly. 3, it brings us modularity. 4, it brings us readability and understanding. 5, we're able to be more efficient. And 6, it brings developer confidence and happiness. And I know we all want that. So that sounds nice, right? Yeah, I think so. I want all teams to have happiness and efficiency. Now's the time that we take front-end development seriously. The back-end had its share of attention. Now it's front-end development's turn to take the spotlight. If I have to give the same presentation in a time frame of a year from now, then I'll be really sad at the opportunities that we've missed as a whole, as a community, as a developer. I want to call all of you out. Make front-end development better. Make it easier to learn. Start tweeting and engaging in discussions about front-end development. We need best practices. We need more material to learn from. You can contribute in many ways. Just having a voice is a contribution. So start voicing your opinions and your experiences. And in fact, we can make a difference starting right now. I want to leave with an exercise for all of you. And don't worry, it's pretty simple, and I know you all love this. Say hello to the person sitting next to you. Yeah, hello. If you know them, great. Great if you already know each other. If you don't, that's even better, right? We're a community. I give you one objective. Can you agree on one thing to make front-end development better? Just one thing, anything. I bet you can. Tweet it to #BetterFrontEnd. For example, D. Fischer and I agree that SCSS is essential for front-end development. #BetterFrontEnd. Thank you, and let's make our community stronger together. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
So at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a good front-end developer. Can you explain, like, what is a good front-end developer? What do they do? How do you identify them?
How to identify a front-end developer, or what is a good one?
What makes a good front-end developer?
It has to do, of course, with their respect of the code, how they lay out classes, how they lay out the semantics, how they structure the files, how they think of changes, the architecture, if they're mindful of the scope of the application. Anything, if you see things that are susceptible to coupling, then I'd be wary. But again, these aren't best practices, so it's really hard to find those qualities. It's very common to see the front-end layer just coupled all over the place, and that's the norm. So it's hard to find these people.
You mentioned HTML and CSS as kind of the tools, I guess, of front-end developers. Where do you see, especially with more and more rich client-side applications coming out, where do you see JavaScript fitting in front-end developer?
I typically make a distinction that there's a difference between front-end development and client-side development. There could be barriers in between. I think a front-end developer should definitely know JavaScript, and especially how to use the interaction that various libraries provide, but having extreme knowledge of how to use JavaScript as a back-end developer doesn't have to be there. And yeah.
So, I wonder if you have any, let's say, high-level things, say when you talk about SCSS, and how you structure things, like, maybe give me an example of, I would often put a group of code that orchestrates my high-level architecture of my front end, and then another set where I deal with, so when I say more specific classes of like style, dialog boxes, and so forth, and then getting down to the nitty-gritty details of a particular page and so forth. Give me some more maybe meaty insight to.
Yeah, I actually forgot. I created this before I actually started the project. There's a project on GitHub. It's called Better Frontend. GitHub/hybrid-group/Better Frontend. And I've actually been writing a lot for the past 3 weeks on stuff like that. So it'd be a great place to visualize it and also shoot back from the community and refine it. So definitely check out that repository. I've given a lot of examples there, and I need a lot more.
I found myself thinking like I didn't agree with you 100%. Someone who's been a front-end developer for quite some time. I think that if you seek out resources, you can find them. I think that if you seek out best practices and have some folks that have experience, because I know you're speaking directly to the Ruby environment, But front-end developers, aren't restricted necessarily to Ruby environment. There's a Java environment, there's a PHP environment, and there are some practices that I feel would address across, regardless of the back end. This is almost as if the front end is being defined by the back end. We can talk offline, but
please, let's.
Yeah,
I want to take your knowledge and put it into this.
Yeah, I just I personally have felt that that a lot of there may be some developers that started out as web developers, and then the industry defined front end and back end. And so even across the country, you have front-end developers that in another part of the country might be user interface developer. And then you have, I think there's different shades. You mentioned it a little bit with JavaScript. Someone I was with, we were seeking front-end developer, but what we really needed was a senior JavaScript developer. Mm-hmm. And so there's these distinctions that happen. But yeah, the effort is definitely needed.
I'd even go as far to say just because there's a lack of distinction, there's a problem, and that in itself is enough to prove the movement that something needs to be done to make it more clear. Someone's looking for talent, they don't really know where to go because it's so muddled in between.
So I think you have some resources, post them, because
Yeah.
I agree with everything you said. And I'm like, yeah, but I don't have anything. I can go and read about how to data model stuff in a database, but how to model stuff on the front end. How do I visually cut this up into divs, sections, and how do I structure?
Part of a big problem is web applications make it that much harder. With the scale of it, you have all these models, you have all these views. It really makes HTML and CSS that much harder. Sure, there's resources on how to do HTML and CSS effectively with your basic web pages, but there really isn't that much content on how to do this with web applications. And I'm not focusing this on Ruby and Rails. It's just a Ruby and Rails community. I say web applications to mean everything's a part of it. And that's really my fundamental view.
I pretty much have to agree with what you're saying. It took 3 separate large-scale projects where we took PSD to HTML and just ran with that. Yeah. And then learning how to modularize, taking this, because just taking these and learning how to modularize them and to come up with a standard workflow to get from PSD to HTML to an actual nicely architected front end.
Yeah. Usually those services, they help you out for the first 3 months, and all of a sudden you realize there is no foresight in there. You're just going to have to rewrite all of it.
You're finding things like where you have hand-coded sizes and lists.
Just the classes you see. It's almost worse than Bootstrap.
There's always Dreamweaver. I was going to say there's always Dreamweaver.
Dare I say we go back to tables?
God, no.
All right, so no questions? We all good? Cool, thank you.